Every murder tells two stories. One is written in crime scenes and evidence. The other lives in the mind, where resentment grows, and one moment can change everything. I'm Kelsey Coffey, and this is Roadside Reckoning, the Vaughn family murders. Before we begin, a content warning: this episode contains discussions of familicide, domestic violence within a marriage, child victims, firearm violence, and contested forensic evidence. Listener discretion is strongly advised. I want you to picture the pre-dawn darkness along a frontage road off Interstate 55, just south of Joliet, Illinois, on June 14th, 2007. Around 5:20 that morning, a man driving to work spotted another man limping along the gravel, bleeding and disoriented, near a red Ford Expedition pulled off the road. When the driver stopped to help and asked if there had been a crash or an attack, the injured man reportedly said words that would define this case. "No, I think my wife shot me." Inside the SUV behind him, first responders would soon find his 34-year-old wife, Kimberly, and their three children, 12-year-old Abigail, 11-year-old Cassandra, and 8-year-old Blake, shot to death. When Illinois State Police and paramedics reached the expedition, they found three children still buckled in the rear seats, each shot multiple times at close range, while Kimberly was in the front passenger seat slumped over the center console. She had a single contact gunshot wound under her chin, the kind of wound that can be seen in suicides, but that also can occur in homicides, depending on position and control of the weapon. Near her feet on the floorboard, investigators recovered a 9mm handgun registered to her husband, 32-year-old Christopher Vaughn, the only survivor in that car. He had two comparatively minor gunshot wounds, a wound to his left wrist and another to his left leg, injuries that were serious but survivable. In those early hours, he was treated as a victim, not a suspect, and released after questioning. The story that would emerge from that stretch of frontage road has become known simply as the Vaughn family murders, or the Christopher Vaughn case. The central mystery sounds deceptively simple. Who pulled the trigger inside that SUV, and why? Prosecutors in Will County would ultimately argue that Christopher executed his wife and three children as obstacles to a new life he had secretly been planning in the Canadian Yukon, casting the case as a calculated familicide driven by selfish fantasy. Christopher, his defense team, and later wrongful conviction advocates would insist that Kimberly was the shooter, that she killed the children, shot him, and then turned the gun on herself, possibly under the influence of medications and mental health struggles. In this episode, I'm going to guide you through the Vaughn family case as an unfolding investigation, not just a verdict. We'll move from who Kimberly and the children were in life to the marriage behind closed doors, through the morning on the road, and into the courtroom where jurors had to decide whether this was a father's calculated slaughter or a mother's unthinkable break. Along the way, we'll also look at the post-conviction efforts that argue the justice system got it wrong, so you can see where the evidence is solid and where it's contested. At the heart of this investigation is a set of questions about motive, escalation, and systems. How a marriage that outwardly seemed stable could contain currents strong enough to end 4 lives. How digital footprints, bloodstain patterns, and financial records were woven into competing stories about intent, and whether red flags were missed before that family loaded into the SUV. We're trying to understand not only what the physical evidence suggests about the shooter's identity, but also how human behavior, mental health, and relationship dynamics were interpreted or misinterpreted by investigators, prosecutors, jurors, and later advocates. Before this became a headline about an SUV and a frontage road, it was a story of a young family building a life in the suburbs of Chicago. Christopher and Kimberly Vaughn moved their family from the Seattle area to Oswego, Illinois, a growing community located about an hour southwest of Chicago, after he landed a job in computer forensics at Navigate Consulting. In Washington, he had founded a licensed private detective agency called Stonebridge Security that specialized in cybercrime investigations, and Kimberly had begun working toward her criminal justice degree with plans of eventually joining him in that work. When the Navigate opportunity arose, they shuttered the business and relocated to Illinois, trading the Pacific Northwest for a Midwest subdivision. By the time of the killings in 2007, Christopher was traveling frequently for Navigate, and Kimberly was primarily a stay-at-home mother. Kimberly Vaughn was 34 when she died. And what emerges from reporting and from families' public statements is a portrait of a woman deeply devoted to her children. Her parents, Del and Susan Phillips, spoke after the sentencing about how Kimberly effectively had taken on the role of both parents because Christopher traveled so much, describing her as the steady, engaged presence in the home. Her mother told reporters she did not believe Christopher had been physically abusive, but characterized him as an absent father, emphasizing that Kim carried the daily weight of parenting. Kimberly's sister and mother both delivered emotional victim impact statements in court, outlining how central she was to their extended family and how profound the loss felt. Those statements were some of the clearest windows we have into Kimberly's life beyond the crime scene. The children, Abigail, Cassandra, and Blake, were in middle childhood and early adolescence, right at that age where routines, school, and small rituals with their parents tend to define their world. Abigail at 12 and Cassandra at 11 were close in age, and Blake, age 8, was the youngest. All three were still young enough to be buckled into the back seat of the family's SUV for a surprise trip. Prosecutors and family members later described them as loved, cherished, and the focus of Kimberly's daily life. Though public records do not offer extensive detail about their individual personalities or interests, what is clear is that the community and their extended family experienced their deaths as the sudden loss of three promising, deeply loved kids, whose lives revolved around school, home, and each other. Oswego itself is a place that, in 2007, embodied the promise of a comfortable, if busy, suburban life. Subdivisions expanding, families commuting into Chicago and its collar counties, and kids piling into SUVs for sports, school functions, and, as in the Vaughn's case, day trips. Christopher's work in computer forensics meant frequent travel across the United States and even into Mexico, downloading and analyzing data for law firms and corporate clients, leaving Kimberly to maintain stability at home. That divide, one partner on the road immersed in a specialized high-pressure job, the other anchored at home with children, set the stage for strains that would later be dissected in court. But on the surface, to neighbors and casual acquaintances, they were another young family, navigating work, kids, and the demands of modern life. Kimberly also lived with significant migraine issues, described in some accounts as stress-related headaches that could leave her nauseated, and which reportedly played a role in her asking Christopher to pull off the highway on the morning of the shootings. That detail would become important later, because her health history and medications she was taking were central to the defense theory she might have been vulnerable. She might have been in a vulnerable state of mind. While for prosecutors, it was a mundane explanation for why the SUV ended up on that gravel road. What we can safely say is that Kimberly was trying to manage chronic pain while raising three children largely on her own, day to day, with a husband who was physically present only part of the time. Those realities can compound stress even in the best of circumstances. When you look back at this family's life before June 14th, there are no publicly documented police reports of domestic violence, no restraining orders, and no official allegations of physical abuse. Friends and relatives did, however, later describe Christopher as emotionally distant and isolated, someone who was more detached than engaged in family life, especially as work took him away. Prosecutors would seize on that emotional distance as part of a larger narrative of a man who had already checked out of his role as husband and father, while defense and later advocates would argue that detachment is not the same as homicidal intent. Standing in the middle of their lives before the crime, all we can say with confidence is that Kimberly and her children were loved by their extended family and community, and that whatever fractures existed behind closed doors were not visible in obvious legal records until it was far too late. To understand the state's theory of the case, we have to look at how prosecutors reconstructed the Vaughn marriage and Christopher's inner life in the years leading up to the murders. In closing arguments and media statements, Will County State's attorneys The Will County State's Attorney and his team portrayed Christopher as a man who had come to see his family as a burden, someone who wanted to abandon suburban responsibilities in favor of a solitary survivalist existence in the Canadian Yukon. They pointed to online postings and messages in which he mused about building a cabin in the Yukon, living off the grid, and being cut off from the world, describing these fantasies as incompatible with fatherhood and marriage. Prosecution framed these writings and searches not as harmless daydreaming, but as evidence of a mindset that saw a wife and children as obstacles to be removed. Financial and lifestyle choices also became part of the state's story about motive and escalation. In the weeks and months before the killings, Christopher spent a significant sum of money at strip clubs, and 2 dancers testified about his visits and interactions, painting a picture of a man investing time and money in escape and fantasy, rather than his home life. Prosecutors argued that he was living a double life, dutiful father and husband on the surface, but in private a man channeling resources and emotional energy into adult entertainment and solitary fantasies. That narrative, they contended, made the leap from emotional abandonment to lethal violence more comprehensible to a jury. The defense, of course, countered that spending at strip clubs and having escapist fantasies, while morally questionable to some, do not automatically translate into murder. Kimberly's health and mental state formed the cornerstone of the competing narrative presented by the defense and later by wrongful conviction advocates. They emphasized her history of severe migraines and suggested that a combination of prescribed medications and stress could have affected her mood and impulses, though the specific pharmacological details and any documented psychiatric diagnoses must be drawn carefully from medical evidence rather than speculation. Investigating Innocence, an organization that later took up Christopher's case, has argued that certain forensic findings, including bullet trajectories, are consistent with a scenario in which Kimberly shot the children then herself. Defense experts in the original trial likewise contended that aspects of the bloodstain patterns and gunshot residue testing could support a murder-suicide rather than a familicide by Christopher. These claims remain hotly disputed by the original prosecutors and have not to date resulted in a new trial. Family members' observations about the relationship add another, more human layer to these competing depictions. Kimberly's parents described Christopher as emotionally withdrawn and frequently away, but they did not report clear signs that she feared for her life or her children's safety before the murders, something that has been underscored in their public comments. They expressed shock that someone they accepted as an in-law could, in their view, commit such violence, saying they had no indication he could be capable of it, which prosecutors used to highlight the hidden nature of some domestic risk factors. On the other side, Christopher's parents have become vocal advocates for his innocence, asserting that their son loved his children and could not have killed them, and supporting legal efforts to challenge aspects of the investigation and prosecution. These dueling family narratives illustrate just how differently the same marriage can be remembered once violence explodes. What we don't have in the public record are prior police calls for domestic violence or a documented history of Christopher threatening Kimberly or the children. Facts that have been noted by both supporters and critics of the conviction. The state argued that his motive was rooted less in explosive rage and more in cold calculation. If he truly wanted to disappear into the wilderness and escape responsibilities, they maintained, he would have plotted a way to do so that avoided leaving them behind as witnesses or obligations. The defense pushed back that, absent a documented pattern of threats or prior violence, it was just as plausible that a sudden break, potentially tied to health or medication, could have driven Kimberly to those who knew her. Both sides were, in different ways, asking jurors to bridge gaps in the evidence about inner thoughts with inferences drawn from outward behavior. In the early morning hours of June 14, 2007, the Vaughn family left their home in Oswego, Illinois, for what was supposed to be a surprise trip to Knights Action Park. a waterpark in Springfield, about a 3-hour drive away. According to prosecutors, Christopher told the children they were going to have a fun outing, loading them into the family's red Ford Expedition while it was still dark outside. At some point on Interstate 55, Kimberly reportedly felt sick, consistent with descriptions of her migraine-related nausea, and asked him to pull off the highway. He exited onto a frontage road near Bluff Road and Interstate 55 in Channahon Township, Will County, and parked on the gravel path. That is the last point in the timeline on which both sides generally agree before the gunfire starts. Around 5:20 to 5:25 a.m., a motorist driving that frontage road saw Christopher limping away from the parked Expedition. The passerby noticed that Christopher appeared injured and disoriented and stopped to help, asking if he had been in an accident or attacked. Christopher reportedly responded, "No, I think my wife shot me." And that was documented in early news reports and would later be played for jurors in the form of witness testimony and interviews. The driver called 911 and Christopher remained with him until first responders arrived, rather than fleeing the area altogether. That detail would later be used by the defense to argue that he did not behave like someone trying to escape a murder scene, while prosecutors emphasized that staying put did not preclude guilt. When police and paramedics reached the SUV, they found a scene that veteran investigators later described as among the most haunting of their careers. All 3 children were in the rear seating area, still buckled in, each having sustained 2 gunshot wounds, one to the chest and one to the head in some accounts, fired at close range. Kimberly was slumped over the center console from the front passenger seat with a contact gunshot wound under her chin and no other fatal injuries, indicating that a single shot had killed her. The 9mm handgun belonging to Christopher was located near her feet on the passenger side floorboard, an arrangement that would later fuel disputes over who held the gun when. Christopher himself had a gunshot injury to his left wrist and another to his left leg, both serious but not life-threatening, and was transported to a hospital for treatment. In those first hours, Illinois State Police publicly described Christopher as a victim, not a suspect. He was questioned at length, but not placed under arrest, and investigators even told reporters they did not believe anyone else beside the family was involved, suggesting that whatever had happened was contained to that vehicle. Gunshot residue tests were performed on Kimberly's hands, a routine step in potential homicide and suicide cases. While early autopsy planning began for all 4 victims, authorities emphasized that they were working to get down to the truth of what had happened, but did not immediately label the deaths as murder-suicide or multiple murders. This initial posture would shift dramatically as more forensic information and statements came in. Over the next days and weeks, detectives conducted multiple formal conducted both at the hospital and later at Illinois State Police facilities. In some of those sessions, later described in trial coverage, he claimed to not remember the shootings at all, claiming his memory stopped with pulling off the road because Kimberly fell ill. In a subsequent taped interview played for jurors, he recounted a version in which he got back into the SUV, saw that Kimberly had the gun, put up his hand, heard a loud noise, and said everything went quiet, after which he fled the vehicle in shock. These evolving accounts gave investigators a narrative they can compare against physical evidence, but they also provided the defense with material to argue that he had been manipulated or confused under pressure. Remain a focal point of post-conviction criticism. By late July 2007, roughly 6 weeks after the killings, the Will County State's Attorney's Office had taken the position that Kimberly was not the shooter, and that Christopher had killed all 4 family members. On July 25th, a Will County grand jury indicted Christopher Vaughn on 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each victim, alleging that he shot his wife and 3 children without lawful justification and with the intent to kill. The indictment described the crime scene as a red Ford Expedition parked on a secluded service road near Bluff Road and Interstate 55 at about 5:30 a.m. on June 14th. After the indictment, Christopher was taken into custody without bond, shifting the public narrative from sympathetic survivor to accused family annihilator. That change in status reflects the point at which early investigative theories hardened into a formal prosecution path. Even at this stage, there were already seeds of future dispute embedded in the record. The single contact gunshot wound under Kimberly's chin, the location of the handgun at her feet, and the lack of other fatal injuries to her body, and the pattern of shots to the children were all pieces of a puzzle that could be arranged into different pictures depending on one's starting assumptions. Investigators and prosecutors read them as evidence of a father systematically shooting his family and staging a scene to suggest his wife was responsible, while defense experts and later investigating innocence analysts have argued that the same physical layout can be reconciled with Kimberly firing the weapon. Those competing interpretations would come to define the battle over what really happened in those final minutes on the frontage road. The Vaughn case fell under the search warrants were executed on the Vaughn family home in Oswego. Vehicles and electronic devices allowing investigators to comb through Christopher's computer activity, emails, and online postings, as well as financial records for any evidence of planning or motive. They also collected extensive forensic evidence from the SUV, including bloodstain patterns, bullet trajectories, and trace evidence. Autopsies confirmed that each child had been shot twice, at close range, while buckled in their seats, and that Kimberly died from a single contact gunshot wound under her chin. Early public statements by the coroner noted that gunshot residue testing was conducted on Kimberly's hands, which is standard when investigators must consider the possibility of a self-inflicted shot. Christopher's injuries were cataloged as a through-and-through wound on his left wrist and a wound on his left leg, often described in media coverage as superficial or survivable, compared to the fatal injuries suffered by the others. For prosecutors, the disparity in wound severity, minor injuries to him, fatal shots to everyone else, became a key part of their argument that he orchestrated the attack. For defense and later advocates, those wounds were consistent with Christopher's account of putting up his hand when the gun went off, and then being shot again when he tried to flee. An interpretation they argue was not adequately credited. Bloodstain pattern analysis and bullet trajectory work inside the expedition was central to the investigative narrative. The state relied on its own forensic experts to argue that the distribution of blood and the angles of the shots were inconsistent with Kimberly handling the weapon in a way that would allow her to kill the children than herself, especially from the front passenger seat. Years later, the defense retained crime scene experts including analyst Tom Bevel and firearms specialist Lucian Haig, who conducted their own reconstruction using dowel rods and lasers to trace bullet paths through Cassandra's seat and into the third row. Those experts concluded that at least one fatal shot trajectory lined up with being fired or near where Kimberly was seated, which they argued supported a murder-suicide scenario. This is one of the most contested aspects of the case, with each side accusing the other of misreading or selectively emphasizing the physical evidence. Digital forensics and financial records provided another layer of investigative breakthroughs for the prosecution. Investigators found that Christopher had researched survivalist topics and the Yukon, and that he had communicated online about building a remote cabin and living off the land away from society. Bank and credit card statements showed substantial spending at strip clubs in the period leading up to the murders, reinforcing the image of a man investing in escapism and self-gratification. In jail, he produced lengthy writings filled with runes and symbolic references, which an FBI expert decoded including a mention of an exotic dancer. While these writings did not explicitly describe killing his family, prosecutors used them to underscore themes of detachment and fantasy. Supporters of Christopher later argued that these writings and spending patterns, though unflattering, were stretched beyond their probative value to paint him as monstrous. Perhaps the most pivotal investigative development from the state's perspective was the evolution of Christopher's own statements. In taped interviews, he initially claimed memory loss around the shootings, but later acknowledged seeing Kimberly with the gun, raising his hand, hearing shots before fleeing. Statements that prosecutors said undercut any claim of total amnesia and placed him as an active observer rather than a blank slate. The state argued that the inconsistencies and shifts in his account over time reflected consciousness of guilt, while the defense suggested they were the product of trauma, confusion, and sophisticated interrogation techniques, including efforts by a detective to bond with him by describing fictitious marital problems. Post-conviction advocates have highlighted these interrogations as examples of how vulnerable suspects can be steered into damaging narratives. By the time the case went to trial, the prosecution's investigative picture was that of a man who had carefully considered shedding his family to pursue a solitary life, and who used the early morning trip and Kimberly's illness as an opportunity. The defense's picture, grounded in an alternative forensic interpretation and Kimberly's health history, was of a marriage under strain where she, not he, might have reached a breaking point in that SUV. Layered on top of those dueling interpretations, later lawsuits by Christopher's supporters have alleged that investigators and prosecutors manipulated or misrepresented certain DNA test results before the grand jury, claims that officials adamantly deny. Those allegations underscore that even before jurors heard opening statements, there were fault lines in how evidence was being gathered, communicated, and understood. Christopher Vaughn was tried in Will County Circuit Court on 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each of the killings of Kimberly, Abigail, Cassandra, and Blake. Under Illinois state law at the time, a conviction on multiple counts of first-degree murder, particularly involving children, carried a mandatory sentence of natural life in prison without the possibility of parole, since the death penalty had been abolished in the state. The trial began in August 2012 and lasted about 5 weeks, with more than 80 witnesses called to testify about everything from forensics and finances to character and family dynamics. A Will County jury would eventually deliberate for less than an hour before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The prosecution's theory in court was stark. Christopher, they argued, had grown tired of his family life and viewed his wife and children as impediments to a new identity, as a rugged, solitary survivalist. They pointed to his Yukon fantasies, heavy strip club spending, emotional distance at home, and the calculated nature of luring the family into an early morning surprise trip as evidence of premeditation. They described how he allegedly shot Kimberly in the SUV, then methodically shot each child at close range while they were strapped into their seats, before wounding himself superficially to stage an attack by his wife. Prosecutors framed his statement, "I think my wife shot me," as part of that staging, a line designed to set investigators on the wrong trail from the very moment he encountered the passerby. Post-verdict remarks, the prosecution called Vaughn a sociopath and psychopath, underscoring how thoroughly the state embraced a narrative of cold-blooded, self-centered brutality. The defense offered a fundamentally different story, asserting that Kimberly was the shooter and that Christopher was a survivor of a murder-suicide who then became the focus of investigative tunnel vision. They argued that her history of migraines, reported stress, and the medications she was taking could have combined in dangerous ways. Those specific causal links between any drug regimen and violence must be carefully grounded in medical evidence. They pointed to the contact wound under her chin, the absence of additional fatal injuries, and certain bullet trajectories as consistent with her holding the gun and firing at both children and then at herself. Defense experts Defense experts criticized aspects of the state's bloodstain pattern analysis and argued that some forensic data had been misinterpreted or selectively presented. They also framed Christopher's shifting statements not as signs of guilt, but as evidence of trauma, confusion, and suggestive interrogation. Inside the courtroom, jurors heard from an array of witnesses that brought both narratives to life. For the state, forensic analysts walked through diagrams and photos of the expedition interior, explaining blood patterns, bullet holes, and trajectories in support of their conclusion that the shots could not have been fired in the way the defense suggested. Medical examiners described the wounds to each victim and the relative severity of Christopher's injuries, reinforcing the view that his wounds were inconsistent with a genuine attempt on his life, compared with the fatal shots delivered to the rest of the family. 2 former strippers testified about Vaughn's spending and demeanor at clubs, and an FBI expert decoded his jailhouse rune writings, which prosecutors used to illustrate themes of detachment and fantasy, albeit without explicit confessions. For the defense, experts like Tom Bevel and Lucian Haig, more fully highlighted later by investigating innocence, provided alternative interpretations of the same physical evidence. Both sides argued vigorously in closing arguments that the physical evidence, when layered onto the relationship context, led inextricably to their version of events. Prosecutors stressed that there was no documented history of Kimberly being violent to herself or others, while there was evidence of Christopher's desire to rid himself of family obligations and live alone. The defense, in turn, emphasized that there were no prior police reports of Christopher threatening or harming his family, and argued that Kimberly's health struggles and the forensic layout provided a viable alternative that created reasonable doubt. Jurors, after hearing weeks of detailed testimony, sided decisively with the prosecution, returning guilty verdicts on all 4 counts in less than an hour of deliberation. That speed has since been cited by both supporters and critics, by some as evidence of a strong case, by others as a sign that alternative theories were never truly weighed. At sentencing on November 26, 2012, the Will County judge denied Christopher's motion for a new trial and imposed 4 consecutive life terms of natural life in prison without the possibility of parole. Under Illinois state law, given the multiple murder convictions and the abolition of the death penalty, there was effectively no other sentencing option. In court, Kimberly's mother and identical twin sister delivered emotional statements describing the devastation the murders had wrought on their family and pleading for the maximum sentence. Christopher declined an opportunity to address the court, reportedly replying no thank you when asked if he wished to speak. For Kimberly's family, the sentence represented a measure of justice, even if it could never restore what was lost. In the years since the trial, Kimberly's family has continued to live with an absence that no legal outcome could fully address. Public statements from her parents and sister have focused less on the mechanics of the crime and more on the enduring grief of losing a daughter and 3 grandchildren, and the everyday moments that will never happen: birthdays, graduations, quiet family gatherings. They have spoken of Kimberly as a devoted mother who took the role of both parents because Christopher traveled so much, reinforcing the image of her as the emotional center of the household. For them, the conviction and life sentence confirmed what they had come to believe about Christopher's responsibility, allowing them to frame their advocacy around honoring the victims rather than relitigating the facts. Community-wide, the Vaughn murders contributed to a broader sense of unease about domestic violence and the hidden risk in seemingly ordinary families. The image of 3 children still belted into their seats and a mother dead beside them in a family SUV resonated far beyond Oswego and Will County, becoming a cautionary example in media coverage and podcasts about familicide. Memorial services, including the funeral at which Christopher was reportedly arrested, offered spaces for collective mourning, even as the legal narrative shifted from survivor to suspect. Over time, coverage of the case has tended to focus either on the prosecution's narrative of calculated betrayal or on the post-conviction movement that insists the state got it wrong. In both conversations, it is important to not lose sight of the lives that were actually lived by Kimberly, Abigail, Cassandra, and Blake. On the other side of the legal divide, Christopher's parents and a network of advocates have spent recent years pursuing new reviews of the evidence. Organizations like Investigating Innocence have taken up the case, publishing analyses that argue bullet trajectories and certain bloodstain patterns were consistent with a murder-suicide initiated by Kimberly, rather than an execution carried out by Christopher. In 2022, a lawsuit was filed claiming that the grand jury that indicted Christopher was misled by prosecutors about DNA test results, allegations that, if true, would represent serious misconduct, but that prosecutors and the Will County State's Attorney's Office adamantly deny. Officials stress they presented testimony from around 90 witnesses at trial and that the jury's swift guilty verdict reflected the strength of the case. As of this recording, those post-conviction efforts have not resulted in a new trial or overturned conviction. The Vaughn case highlights how difficult it can be, even with extensive forensic work, to achieve consensus about what happened inside a confined, chaotic crime scene. Both the state's experts and the defense's reconstruction specialists worked from the same physical space, a Ford Expedition on a gravel road, but reached different conclusions about angles, positions, and plausibility. Later, Investigating Innocence's trajectory analysis added another layer of interpretation, suggesting that some bullet paths were consistent with Kimberly holding the gun. Prosecutors stand by their original experts and maintain that the totality of evidence, including motive and behavior, points squarely at Christopher. For listeners, this means sitting with ambiguity, recognizing that a conviction represents the legal system's best current answer, while also acknowledging that good faith disputes over evidence can persist long after a jury speaks. The Vaughn family story also underscores how escalation in relationships can look very different depending on which details are visible to outsiders. In this case, there were no public protective orders, no law enforcement callouts for domestic violence, and no widely reported threats. Yet prosecutors argued that financial choices, emotional withdrawal, and private fantasies about abandoning one's family formed a pattern of risk that ended in lethal violence. What you have just heard is more than just a crime story. It's a glaring reminder of how quickly emotions can turn fatal and how often warning signs go unseen. Until next time, I'm Kelsey Coffey reminding you to lock your doors, bolt your windows, and beware the dangers hiding in plain sight.